History books are filled with the arrogant footsteps of emperors who believed that drawing lines on a piece of parchment paper meant owning the earth. They measured their worth by the blood they spilled and the kingdoms they turned to ash, unaware that time would eventually erase them all. Among them was a young ruler whose ambition knew no bounds, a man who wore gold and iron not just for protection, but as a statement to the gods. Every piece of his armor was crafted to reflect a terrifying power that aimed to conquer every single corner of the known world. Standing beneath a dark and unforgiving stormy sky, Alexander the Great looked down upon the world with a chilling sense of destiny. To him, the earth was not a home to be shared, but a prize to be violently taken, and his gaze carried the weight of 1,000 fallen empires. Behind him marched the greatest war machine the ancient world had ever witnessed. Thousands of soldiers, moving as a single destructive force under the burning dust of the sunset, carrying long spears that pierced the horizon, ready to crush any civilization that dared to question their master's divine right to rule. As those heavy leather boots stomped mercilessly upon the dry, cracked earth of new lands, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Every step forward was a violent reminder that the unstoppable march of empire leaves nothing behind but dust, silence, and the bitter memory of a forgotten peace. Riding his legendary stallion Bucephalus through the fading golden hour light, Alexander felt invincible. The world was bending to his absolute will, and at this very moment, his ego had grown so immense that he believed even death itself would hesitate before challenging the master of the world. Yet, as the massive stone gates of conquered fortresses creaked open, revealing the smoke and ruin of his victories, a deeper hunger remained unsatisfied. The more kingdoms he destroyed, the more he realized that external power could never truly fill the void within a restless human soul. It was at the mysterious and mist-covered borders of India where his unstoppable march encountered something entirely unexpected. Before them lay a dense, dark jungle that did not tremble at the sound of trumpets, an ancient land guarded not by walls of stone, but by an overwhelming, silent mystery. Deep inside the flickering shadows of his military tent, a weathered messenger brought strange news that broke the fated conqueror's focus. The spy spoke not of hidden armies or treacherous kings, but of wise, naked men who lived in the heart of the forest, completely indifferent to the coming storm. These men, known to the Greeks as the Gymnosophists, sought refuge beneath the giant roots of ancient banyan trees. They did not build temples, they did not accumulate wealth, and they spent their days meditating in a profound serenity that the chaos of the outside world could never touch. Sitting entirely still upon the bare earth, with no possessions and no clothes to shield him, the oldest bilge embodied a freedom that Alexander could not comprehend. He owned absolutely nothing, yet his eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who possessed the entire universe within his own mind. Here, at the edge of the known world, the ultimate contrast was born. On one side stood the heavy, cold iron of a conqueror who needed the whole world to feel powerful. On the other side, the bare skin of a sage who needed nothing. The world's greatest conqueror was about to face a power that could never be dazed by a sword. Driven by an intense curiosity that his golden crown could not satisfy, Alexander the Great decided to leave his royal comfort behind. He stepped into the damp, unforgiving dirt of the ancient forest, determined to see the men who dared to ignore his absolute global authority. With every step he took deeper into the jungle, the heavy silence of nature seemed to challenge the loud, chaotic echo of his vast empire. The master of the world was now walking on a ground where his laws held absolutely no power, and his titles meant nothing to the trees. When he finally found them by the rushing waters of a sacred river, he was shocked by what he saw. These sages sat completely naked around a small, smoking campfire, wrapped in a level of peace so deep it felt like a physical wall protecting them from the outside world. Standing over them like a god of war, Alexander looked down with a gaze that had made kings weep and nations surrender. He expected them to tremble, to beg for mercy, or at least to bow their heads in the presence of the man who owned the earth. But the lead sage, Dandamis, did not even blink. His deeply weathered face, carved by years of sun and wind, remained as still as stone, and when his calm eyes met the fiery stare of the conqueror, there was no fear, only a profound, silent pity. To break the silence, Alexander ordered his servants to display unimaginable wealth. Heavy wooden chests were thrown onto the dirt, bursting open with gold coins, priceless silks, and royal crowns, offering a fortune that could buy entire nations in an instant. Alexander spoke with the arrogance of a supreme master, promising them everything their hearts could ever desire. He told them that if they followed him and served his court, They would live in palaces of gold and be revered as the wisest men in his new empire. A gentle, knowing smile appeared on the lips of the old sage. He looked at the mountain of gold and jewels not with greed, but with the same indifference one would show to a pile of dry autumn leaves rotting on the forest floor. Dandamis spoke, and his voice carried a weight that shook the young king to his core. He told Alexander that all his conquests were a tragic illusion, and that a man who could not control his own desires was nothing more than a miserable slave to his own ambition. No one in the history of the world had ever spoken to Alexander in such a manner. The king's heart raced, his blood boiled with anger, and for a split second, the temptation to draw his legendary blade and end the old man's life flashed through his mind. His hand gripped the cold handle of his sword, and the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. A single movement of his wrist could prove his absolute power over life and death, yet something about the sage's complete lack of fear made the king freeze in hesitation. In that terrifying moment of tension, the greatest conqueror of antiquity realized a devastating truth. He could kill this man's body, but he could never conquer his mind. The sword that had broken the world was completely useless against a soul that desired nothing. Breaking the heavy silence, Dandamis slowly stood up from the bare earth, facing the Golden King not as a subject, but as an equal. He told Alexander that a true conqueror does not need to rule over others, for the greatest empire a man can ever win is the mastery over his own mind and passions. The wise old man explained that everything Alexander had built through war and blood was temporary, a mere shadow in the grand scale of time. He warned the king that true freedom is not the ability to control millions of lives, but the strength to remain untamed by the illusion of worldly power. Behind Alexander, his fierce generals listened in absolute shock. They had conquered the mightiest armies of Persia and Egypt, yet these few words from a penniless sage were piercing through their heavy armor, shaking the very foundation of their beliefs. "You cross oceans and destroy nations just to escape your own inner emptiness," Dandamis said with a gentle yet piercing voice. "But when your short life ends, Alexander, you will occupy no more earth than the very patch of dirt you are standing on right now." For the first time in his life, the young conqueror felt the freezing cold of absolute vulnerability. The brutal honesty of the sage was a mirror that Alexander could not break, forcing him to face the terrifying truth of his own mortality. He realized that despite all his crowns, his vast armies, and his endless gold, he was just a fragile leaf carried away by the ruthless river of time, no different from the thousands of soldiers he had sent to their graves. Dandamis pointed out that nature provides everything a human soul truly needs for peace. The river gives water, the forest gives shelter, and the mind gives wisdom. Everything else that humans hoard is nothing but a heavy chain they willingly wrap around their necks. The fierce anger that usually defined Alexander's gaze dissolved into a profound, quiet melancholy. In the presence of a man who wanted absolutely nothing from him, the master of the world felt strangely poor, realizing that his entire life had been a frantic chase after shadows. A strange wave of contemplation spread through the Macedonian camp. The iron discipline of the empire was momentarily broken by an ancient truth that spoke directly to the exhausted souls of men who had spent years fighting for another man's dream. In an act of rare humility that stunned his army, Alexander slowly reached up and removed his heavy golden helmet. Standing bareheaded before the naked philosopher, he stripped away the divine persona he had forced upon the world, exposing the fragile youth underneath. He stared at the golden crown that had defined his existence, suddenly realizing how heavy it truly was. Every victory had come with a cost, and every nation he conquered had only added to the internal weight he carried every single day. Here, under the ancient canopy of a land he could never truly own, the ultimate truth became clear to the young king. The world could be conquered by force, but peace could only be found by surrendering the ego to something far greater than oneself. As the golden helmet touched the cold forest dirt, the illusion of supreme power shattered. Alexander stood exposed, a king without a crown, facing an ancient wisdom that could not be bought, bribed, or broken by the swords of his mighty empire. For the first time since he began his bloody march across continents, a single silent tear rolled down the fated conqueror's cheek. It was not a tear of anger, but of a profound spiritual awakening, washing away years of accumulated pride. In his mind's eye, the vast empires he had built suddenly felt like houses of sand, waiting to be swept away by the inevitable winds of time. The glory he had chased through blood and ash was turning into nothing but a beautiful, tragic illusion. Breaking his silence once more, the sage Dandamis pointed to the heavens. He told Alexander that the stars do not belong to kings, and the earth does not remember the names of conquerors. True wealth belongs only to the soul that has mastered its own endless hunger. Then, an event occurred that would leave historians in absolute disbelief for centuries. Alexander the Great, the Lord of Asia, bowed his head deeply to a penniless, naked philosopher, surrendering his massive ego to a power far greater than his throne. "Go now, Alexander," the sage said softly, as the fire died down. "Continue your journey across the earth, but remember this day. Your time on this world is short, and the ultimate victory is not conquering others, but conquering yourself." As the burning crimson sun began to dip below the horizon, Alexander turned his back on the silent jungle. He walked away from the sacred river, not as a brutal conqueror who had taken another land, but as a student who had just received the greatest lesson of his life. Back in the heavy silence of his war tent, his generals waited for orders to burn the forest. But Alexander stood in complete silence, his mind drifting back to the calm, fearless eyes of the naked sage who had defeated him without drawing a single weapon. Looking out at the thousands of campfires burning across the plains, Alexander realized the tragic reality of his destiny. He had built the greatest empire in human history, yet he felt entirely alone, a prisoner of the very machine he had created. He whispered to his closest friends the words that would echo through eternity, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Dandamis." For he knew that while his own name was written in blood, the sage's peace was written in eternity. Soon after, the global march of the unstoppable empire came to an unexpected halt. Alexander ordered his great army to turn back, abandoning his dream of conquering the edge of the world, forever changed by his encounter with the wise men of the East. Only a few years later, at the young age of 32, Alexander the Great would lie dying in a distant palace in Babylon, struck down not by an enemy's blade, but by a sudden, fatal fever, leaving his massive empire to collapse into ruin. As he lay on his deathbed in Babylon, surrounded by weeping generals, the gold on his walls could not buy him a single extra breath. The master of the world was now entirely powerless against the quiet arrival of his own mortality. In his final moments, his mind did not drift to his greatest battles or the cities he burned. Instead, he remembered the words of the naked sage in the Indian forest, realizing that he was leaving this earth exactly as he entered it, completely empty-handed. He left behind a vast empire that stretched across 3 continents, but without his iron will to hold it together, the giant machine instantly began to shatter, tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war born of endless human greed. The crowns he had distributed, the borders he had drawn with blood, and the laws he had forced upon millions vanished almost overnight, proving that any power built on fear and violence is bound to turn into ash. Centuries passed, and the magnificent cities named after Alexander were swallowed by the shifting desert sands. His name became a distant echo, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of history libraries. Yet, deep in the heart of the East, the memory of the silent philosophers remained untouched. Their wisdom did not need empires, weapons, or stone monuments to survive. It lived quietly within the human soul. This historic clash between the world's greatest conqueror and the naked sage leaves us with a terrifying question. Who was the true victor? The man who owned everything but controlled nothing, or the man who owned nothing but controlled his own mind? We live in a modern world that constantly commands us to conquer, to accumulate, and to chase after the illusions of external status. We are taught that our value is measured only by the heavy chains of gold we manage to collect. We build our own empires of stress and anxiety, running blindly after a future that never arrives, only to find ourselves completely trapped inside the prison of our own endless, unsatisfied desires. But the timeless wisdom of Stoicism and the Eastern sages reminds us that the exit door is always open. True power is not found in dominating the outside world, but in mastering the chaotic landscape within your own mind. When you stop demanding that the world bend to your expectations, you find a freedom that no emperor can ever conquer. You become the true sovereign of your life, untouchable by the storms of fate. For in the grand theater of existence, the greatest empire you will ever rule is the one inside your chest. Wealth is not what you hold in your hands, but what you carry within your spirit. Millions of people live their entire lives chasing the loud, chaotic echo of external validation, building grand fortresses of status that are ultimately destined to turn back into dust and forgotten memories. They run from their inner emptiness by trying to conquer everything and everyone around them, never realizing that the very things they hoard are the heavy weights pulling them under. Like Alexander standing before the naked sage, They wear the heavy armor of their pride, terrified of what they might find if they stop fighting and simply face the mirror of their own true self. But the game of life eventually ends for the conqueror and the servant alike, and when the grand board is cleared, all the artificial titles and temporary triumphs dissolve into the absolute equality of time. The empires of the world will continue to rise and fall, and the names of new rulers will be written on walls of stone only to be erased by the ruthless winds of future centuries. Yet, the small, quiet truth discovered in that ancient Indian forest remains entirely untouched by the chaos of human history, waiting for anyone brave enough to seek it. It tells us that you do not need to conquer the world to find your peace. You do not need a golden throne, a vast fortune, or a sea of people chanting your name to feel whole. True sovereign power is the quiet ability to look at the chaotic storm of existence and remain completely unbothered, anchoring your soul in a stillness that no external event can ever shake. It is the courage to drop the heavy weapons of your ego, to walk away from the endless war of comparing yourself to others, and to step onto the sacred ground of your own inner freedom. The next time you find yourself trapped in the relentless race of modern life, exhausted by the endless demands of a world that never stops shouting, take a deep breath and look within. Remember the young king who owned everything but had to learn how to bow, and the naked sage who owned nothing but possessed the entire universe. Ask yourself, which empire are you currently fighting for? For the greatest conqueror is not the one who subdues the earth, but the one who completely liberates his own soul. Master your mind, and you will finally rule the only empire that truly matters.